Lugard. The second threat is disunity of the elite and lack of a common overriding objective that makes us Uganda. Quite often the foundational DNA of something tends to affect it in its old age. The Ugandan state, starting around 1900, was founded on religious bigotry. Captain Lugard, the British colonizing officer, took control of Mengo for Anglicans. He chased away the white Roman Catholic fathers to Buddu so that he could create a distance between himself and a competing religion. He sent the Muslims, at the time they used to call them Mohammedans, he sent them to Utambala, and he took himself the prize of the city of Kampala that would emerge after 1907. Therefore, religion, not our relationship with God, has in the past 126 years been a factor in our organizing politically. In Ankole in the 1950s, we had a group called Kumanyana. The meaning of that Kumanyana is we should know each other. Largely that Kumanyana group was composed of one religious and cultural group opposing the status quo of the Nkore kingdom. And there was another one responding to that Kumanyana called Tukafachi. Tukafachi was composed of the elite in the area. The word Tukafachi meant that what have we done in this? And why bother us in this fight? We have no dog in the fight, as the Americans often like to say. These religions also reflected the political party formations in almost all areas of Uganda after 1954. It is the movement, the national resistance movement, during the Civil War in the 1980s that took a third front, that united many of these religions and tribes to face a common enemy. And the common enemy was insecurity and misgovernance. The last 40 years have made Uganda peaceful and one of the most welcoming countries with a high level of religious tolerance. This fabric of religious unity is somehow today fraying, as the last elections showed us. There's a return to the abuse of religion in politics, and people openly campaigning, holding the flags or standing behind the flags of their faith and the flags of their origin, as if these are barometers of how an area needs to be developed or how leaders should emerge. I want you to know that freedom does not always beget freedom. It sometimes breeds anarchy and a resurgence of what is in the foundational DNA. There were also groups inside the movement in the last elections, dressed up in military uniforms, beating up people, invading polling stations in some of the constituencies, shooting and dispersing voters, and then openly doing ballot stuffing. Some of these scenes were extremely disturbing for me to watch. Other people lined up others and paid them to vote for them. No independent choice at all from citizens, some of the citizens in our area. This is what happens when we undermine or when we lack a central uniting idea and we rely on material circumstances to decide our outcomes. Therefore, to heal, a nation must plan an escape hatch by working across different generations, different formations, different religions, ethnic groups, to keep a common front so that we can exercise restraint from the leaders of institutions and to run institutions on merit. I have seen, even in mature states and societies, a fallback to tribal cleavages when the economies run into trouble, or when entrenched groups face technological and financial pressures. But they work with pressure valves. In 1920, when the First World War led to the collapse of three empires, those of you who like history, the Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, Russia, parts of Western Europe, led by Britain and France, along with North America, those countries came together and started the Chatham House, or something called the Royal Institute of International Affairs. They based it in London. They also started a sister agency called Council on Foreign Relations, based in New York. I think the main idea for these institutions was to ensure that there are no more wars and to discuss leadership of international relations through research and understanding the global shifts. Both of these groups I mentioned, they combine people who work in government and they retire, and they also bring in private sector leaders of global corporate entities. For example, the oil companies of Chevron, ExxonMobil of America, the financial institutions like Citigroup, arms maker Northrop Grumman, Pfizer Pharmaceuticals, AI semiconductor chip makers like NVIDIA, even Chinese companies like TikTok and Huawei are all corporate members of those institutions I mentioned that started in 1921. This is how capitalism has been kept alive by the power of some of the ideas of the West. That is how Western scholarship and political leadership keeps its world view intact through changing seasons and generations. Now, you might be like me. You might not agree with some of these Western liberal institutions. You might also know a thing or two about their negative role in our developing countries. They might have failed to stop wars, all those imperial wars, especially the Second World War, because of each nation's selfish agenda. But you have to respect that these institutions often act as pressure release valves for their societies. This is partly how their societies forge a way forward and keep competitive even in changing geopolitical and geo-economic environment. Now, if you want to disagree with me, you need to check with history. Even an inward-looking society like the Jewish state, ancient times, they used to be in antiquity, they always borrowed ideas, inward-looking, but they borrowed ideas from surrounding societies, even as they kept their monotheistic religion. They kept their religious etiquette through writing and teaching. I want you to go and read the account of a Greek writer, 3rd century Greek writer called Menander, who translated the history of Phoenicians in the ancient kingdom of Tyre. Menander writes about the exchange of ideas, riddles, trade, and architecture skills between King Solomon of Israel and King Hiram of Tyre. These are two different religious settings but working together. Tyre had a 245-year lead over Israel as an ancient kingdom with kings. And so they knew how to work with timber and construction materials. Therefore, King Solomon borrowed their labor, their raw materials, their skills, their ideas to build the temple in the 10th century BC. So the question to ask, so you can understand the threat we face, is this: what structures have we created as vents to release pressure in the way we organize our politics and leadership of Uganda? How do we ensure unity of the elite on what really matters for the country and keep together? What is our pressure valve in Uganda and Africa today? What is the solution? I propose that to stave off the rupture of our social and political fabric, we should look at what we are doing at the Uganda Mentorship and Leadership Award, us as PASAID and people of goodwill. Over the last 4 years, we have brought together more than 53 retired men and women and asked the president to kindly recognize them and use them as a sounding board of the raft the country needs to transition on. We do this partly because, again, we look at history. We are not the first in the world. We won't be the last. In the second book of Samuel in the Bible, there is a story of how an instrument of power, religious, social, political power, called the Ark of the Covenant. It was taken in a fight from the children of Israel, taken by the Philistines, and it was kept away for a long time. Some years later, when a king called David wanted to move the Ark of Covenant to its home, where it had been kept, some people think 70 years, others 20, he called people who said, you move this instrument of power on a cart. They put it on a cart and they put an animal to pull the cart. As soon as the animal stumbled and a man called Uzi tried to stabilize the Ark of the Covenant, the box, he was struck down and he died. God killed him. That's what the story says. King David said, stop. He put that instrument of power down for 3 months and went back and consulted broadly. He consulted elders. He consulted young people. He read the law. He looked at traditions. And he created a broad platform on which knowledge on how you shift that instrument to its home was done. Eventually it was found there was a particular way that was forgotten, and it was done very well. The people who we bring for these awards, for example, they are from all walks of life: engineers, academics, lawyers, doctors, politicians, entrepreneurs. Almost every key person the president has worked with in the last 40 years and beyond. Why do we do this? We do this because we see a dearth of wise leadership from many young people who have been raised in a peaceful environment and have sometimes, not always, sometimes very limited knowledge of Uganda's history and its uncanny habit of repeating itself. When young leaders insult or lie or steal or bribe and even murder and get away with some of these crimes, hiding under politics, the way UPC youth wingers used to do in the 1980s, it is a very dangerous precedent. It chases away many good people from public life. It incentivizes criminality in public office. It should be penalized, not ignored, swept under the carpet, or even sometimes rewarded, as I see dangerously. If you see no role for these elders as a stabilizing influence, you are wrong. I want you to read your African history. Let me give you a recent example. President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa turned very recently to a 78-year-old man called Rolf Meyer, a central figure in the anti-apartheid negotiations between de Klerk and President Nelson Mandela in 1993. President Ramaphosa turned to Mr. Rolf Meyer in order to deal with the escalating rift between the US and South Africa and asked him to be an ambassador of South Africa to the US at a time of tension between these two countries, just to help restore calm and trade. Who is Mr. Meyer? He's a white Afrikaner who worked with a black man from the Abatembu Xhosa tribe called Bantu Holomisa, those of you who know Bantu Holomisa, to form a united democratic front, an organization that straddled between the ANC and the discredited white South African government. Meyer worked with Bantu Holomisa to bring peace 33 years ago. But we have other examples in other parts of the world working with older people. In 1986, when the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in the US killed 7 crew members that were going into space, President Reagan turned to a retired physicist. His name was Richard Feynman. Turned to the first woman astronaut, Sally Ride, the first person to break the sound barrier, Chuck Yeager, and Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon. He turned to them for a solution. They were older, but providing ideas and solutions. Countries always call on their successful or older people who have served well to resolve problems of tomorrow, working with young people. That is my motto and my hope for Uganda in the next 5 years. The second threat is disunity of the elite and lack of a common overriding